The harsh crack of a gunshot split the morning air as Grace Lawson stumbled down the dusty main street of Carson City, Nevada, clutching her bleeding arm and fighting back tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. The year was 1873, and the town she had called home for nearly all of her 22 years had become a place of whispers, harsh glances, and now, violence. "Get out of our town, you filthy harlot!" shouted the man who had just fired the warning shot, a respected shopkeeper whose face was now twisted with rage. "We don't want your kind here." Grace's crime had been discovered just 3 days prior, a child growing in her belly with no husband to claim it. The father, a wealthy businessman passing through town, had promised her the world before disappearing with the morning stage, leaving nothing but empty promises and a ruined reputation in his wake. Blood seeped through her fingers as she pressed her hand to her arm. The bullet had only grazed her, but the wound stung fiercely. Behind her, a growing crowd gathered, their faces a blur of disgust and righteous indignation. "Please," she whispered, though no one was close enough to hear. "I have nowhere to go." Sheriff Thompson finally pushed through the crowd, his weathered face unreadable as he approached her. For a moment, Grace felt a flicker of hope. The sheriff had been a friend of her late father's. Surely he would help her. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "you need to leave Carson City, today." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "The town council's decided. Your condition. It sets a bad example for the young ladies. You know how folks feel about these things. But my home is being seized for debts," the sheriff cut in, the lie transparent to both of them. "I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be. Take what you can carry and be gone by sundown." The crowd murmured its approval. Grace spotted Mrs. Henderson, who had taught her Sunday school, Mr. Peterson, who had always given her extra candy as a child, neighbors and friends who now looked at her as if she were something rotten, something to be disposed of. With the last of her dignity, Grace straightened her back and walked toward her small house at the edge of town. She had 2 hours to pack whatever she could into a single bag before the stage left for points west. After that, she had no idea what would become of her. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Grace sat at the dusty crossroads 5 miles outside of Carson City. The stagecoach driver had deposited her here with a mumbled apology when she'd admitted she had no destination in mind and barely enough money for the short ride. Now she sat on her small trunk, her few possessions inside, utterly alone. The crossroads offered 2 paths, one leading west toward California, a journey too far to make on the foot in her condition, and another leading south toward a scattering of ranches and homesteads. Neither seemed particularly promising. As she contemplated her limited options, the distant sound of hoofbeats caught her attention. Grace tensed, wondering if someone from town had followed her to ensure she'd truly gone. She stood shakily, ready to hide if necessary. The rider who came into view was unfamiliar, a tall man with broad shoulders atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. His face was partially shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was handsome, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' growth of beard. His clothes were practical and dusty from the trail, marking him as a working man rather than a city dweller. He slowed his horse as he approached, taking in the sight of a young woman alone at the crossroads with evident surprise. "Afternoon, miss," he called, tipping his hat politely. "You look like you might be in some trouble." Grace hesitated, wary of strange men after her recent experience. "I'm fine, sir. Just resting a moment." The man's blue eyes took in her pale face, the hasty bandage on her arm where the bullet had grazed her, and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. His gaze was direct but not unkind. "Forgive me for saying so, but you don't look fine." He dismounted with easy grace, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Henry Garrett. I own the Double G Ranch about 10 miles south of here." "Grace Lawson," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name. What if he'd heard about her disgrace? If he recognized her name, he gave no indication. "Miss Lawson, I don't make a habit of prying into folks' business, but it's getting on toward evening, and this is no place for a lady to be alone." He gestured to the empty landscape around them. "Might I ask where you're headed?" The simple question nearly broke her composure. Where was she headed? She had no destination, no plan, no future she could envision. Tears welled in her eyes despite her best efforts. I don't know, she admitted, her voice cracking. Henry Garrett studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. Carson City's a small place with a long memory, he said quietly, and folks there can be mighty quick to cast stones. Grace stiffened, realizing he must know something of her situation after all. You've heard then? Heard enough, he acknowledged with a slight nod. News travels, especially the kind folks enjoy spreading. Grace waited for the disgust to cross his face, for him to remount his horse and continue on his way, leaving her to her fate. Instead, he surprised her. Miss Lawson, I've got a proposition for you. My ranch needs a housekeeper, someone to cook meals and keep things in order. Previous lady who did it left to get married last month. It's honest work, with room and board included. He paused, watching her carefully. If you're interested. Grace blinked in shock. You would hire me, knowing what people are saying? Henry Garrett's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. The town turned away from your shame, miss. But you'll find no judgment on my land. What's past is past, and everyone deserves a chance to build a future. His words, spoken without pretense or hidden meaning, struck Grace with their simple kindness. After days of scorn and rejection, the offer seemed almost too good to be true. Why would you help me? She asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Because my mother found herself in similar circumstances once, he said simply. And someone showed her kindness when she needed it most. He gestured toward her bandaged arm. Besides, looks like you've already paid a high enough price for whatever happened. Grace considered his offer. A job, a roof over her head, somewhere safe for her and her child. It was more than she had dared hope for just moments ago. There's a catch, though, Henry added. The ranch is isolated. Just me, a few ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and my foreman and his wife. It's hard country and harder work. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Garrett, Grace said, finding her voice stronger than expected. An isolation sounds preferable to what I just left behind. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Then it's settled. Can you ride? When Grace nodded, he helped her secure her trunk to his saddle, and then, with surprising gentleness for such a large man, assisted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they set off toward the Double G ranch, Grace felt both terrified and relieved. She was heading into the unknown with a stranger, yet something about Henry Garrett's straightforward manner inspired trust. Thank you, she said softly as the crossroads disappeared behind them. Don't thank me yet, he replied, his voice rumbling near her ear. Thank me when you've seen what you're getting yourself into. The sun was setting as they crested a ridge, and Grace caught her first glimpse of what would become her new home. The Double G ranch spread across a valley below them, a sturdy main house and several outbuildings nestled against the backdrop of rugged hills. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that shimmered gold in the fading light. It's beautiful, Grace breathed. It's home, Henry replied simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. As they rode toward the ranch house, Grace wondered what awaited her there. Whatever it was, it had to be better than what she'd left behind. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The Double G ranch revealed itself fully as they approached a sprawling, well-maintained property that spoke of hard work and careful management. The main house was larger than Grace had initially thought, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, stables, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse set a little distance from the main house. As they rode into the yard, a weathered man in his 50s emerged from the barn, followed by a woman wiping her hands on an apron. The foreman and his wife, Grace guessed. That's Frank and Martha Wilson, Henry confirmed, dismounting smoothly before reaching up to help Grace down. Been with me since I started this place 8 years ago. Frank approached, his eyes curious but not unfriendly as they took in Grace and her trunk. Didn't expect to see you back so soon, boss. Found yourself some company in town? Found us a new housekeeper, Henry corrected firmly. Miss Lawson here will be taking over the cooking and household duties. Miss Lawson, this is Frank Wilson, my foreman, and his wife Martha. Martha stepped forward. A woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Welcome to Double G, Miss Lawson. We've been making do with my cooking since Mrs. Collins left, but the men will be glad for someone who can do more than fry beans and bacon." Grace managed a smile, grateful for the woman's matter-of-fact welcome. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I hope I won't disappoint." "It's Martha, dear, and you look dead on your feet. Let's get you settled before anything else." Henry nodded. "Martha, show Miss Lawson to the housekeeper's room. I'll bring her trunk." To Grace he added, "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to get acquainted with your duties." Martha led Grace into the house, chatting easily as they moved through a spacious main room with a large stone fireplace. The men usually take breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, and supper after the day's work. 5 ranch hands besides Frank and the boss. They're good men, respectful. You won't have trouble from them. The housekeeper's room was at the back of the house, on the ground floor, a small but comfortable space with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking a kitchen garden. It was simple but clean, and after the events of the past few days, it looked like paradise to Grace. Henry arrived with her trunk, setting it down carefully. "There's a pump in the kitchen for water. Outhouse is out back. If you need anything else, Martha's room is across the hall." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. This is more than generous." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest, Miss Lawson. We can talk more tomorrow." With a nod to Martha, he left them. When he was gone, Martha turned to Grace with motherly concern. "Are you hungry, dear? I can bring you something from the kitchen." The kindness threatened to undo Grace completely. "That would be wonderful, thank you," she managed. Left alone, Grace sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. Just hours ago, she'd been cast out from the only home she'd ever known, facing an uncertain future with a child on the way, and nowhere to turn. Now she had a roof over her head, the promise of work, and people who, so far at least, seemed willing to accept her presence without judgment. The wound on her arm throbbed, a painful reminder of what she'd left behind. She unwrapped the hasty bandage to examine it. The bullet had only grazed her, leaving a furrow across her upper arm that was red and angry, but not dangerously deep. A soft knock announced Martha's return. The older woman carried a tray with a bowl of stew, bread, and a cup of tea. She set it down on the small table by the window, then frowned when she noticed Grace's arm. "That needs tending," she said decisively. "Eat your supper. I'll be back with some supplies." When Martha returned, she brought warm water, clean cloths, and a jar of salve that smelled strongly of herbs. With gentle efficiency, she cleaned Grace's wound, applied the salve, and wrapped it in a fresh bandage. "How did this happen?" she asked, her tone conversational rather than prying. Grace hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Someone in town objected to my presence." Martha's lips tightened. "With a gun? Civilized folk Carson City claims to be?" She shook her head. "Well, you're safe here now." Does Mr. Garrett often take in strays?" Grace asked cautiously. Martha smiled. "Henry's got a good heart under that stern exterior, but no, can't say he makes a habit of rescuing folks from roadsides." She patted Grace's uninjured arm. "Must have seen something in you worth saving." After Martha left, Grace ate the simple but filling meal, then unpacked her few belongings. Among them was a small photograph of her parents, both gone now, her father to a mining accident when she was 16, her mother to influenza 2 years later. What would they think of her now? Her mother, always so proper and concerned with appearances, would have been mortified. Her father. She liked to think he might have stood by her. Exhaustion overtook her as she changed into her nightgown. As she drifted towards sleep, Grace wondered about Henry Garrett. Why had he really stopped to help her? What had he meant about his mother being in similar circumstances? And most puzzling of all, how could he so easily offer no judgment when everyone else had been so quick to condemn? Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the distant sounds of men preparing for the day's work. Grace woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. With a renewed sense of purpose, she dressed quickly, choosing her most practical dress and pinning her honey-brown hair neatly. By the time she made her way to the kitchen, Martha was already there, stoking the fire in the large cook stove. "Good morning, dear," Martha greeted her. "Thought I'd give you a hand this first day, show you where everything is. Men will be in soon." hungry as bears. Together they prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, eggs, and strong coffee. As Martha had predicted, the ranch hands arrived with the first light of dawn, 5 men of varying ages, who greeted Grace with respectful nods and curious glances. Frank Wilson introduced them briefly. Tom and Mike, brothers who'd been with the ranch for 3 years. Old Pete, a grizzled veteran of the range with a perpetual squint. Young Charlie, barely 20 and eager to prove himself. And Eduardo, a skilled horseman from Mexico, who spoke little but observed everything. Henry Garrett came in last, freshly shaven, and dressed for work in sturdy denim pants, a blue cotton shirt, and well-worn boots. He nodded to Grace. "Morning, Miss Lawson. Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Garrett." She set a plate of flapjacks on the table, aware of the men's curious glances at this exchange. "Miss Lawson's our new housekeeper," Henry announced to the men who hadn't met her yet. "I expect you all to show her the same respect you'd show your own mothers or sisters." His tone left no room for argument, though none of the men seemed inclined to object. Breakfast proceeded with the men discussing the day's work mending fences in the north pasture, moving cattle to fresh grazing lands, breaking a new batch of horses. Grace served efficiently, gradually growing more comfortable in her role. She noticed that while the men joked and teased each other freely, they maintained a careful politeness around her. After the men had filed out to begin their day's work, Henry lingered, pouring himself a final cup of coffee. "If you're up to it," he said, "I'd like to show you around the ranch once you've finished with breakfast cleanup. You should know the place if you're going to be living here." Grace agreed readily, and an hour later, they set out on horseback, Grace riding a gentle mare named Daisy that Henry assured her was perfect for an inexperienced rider. The morning was clear and cool, the vastness of the Nevada landscape stretching in every direction. Double G covers about 5,000 acres, Henry explained as they rode. Good grazing land for the most part, though water can be scarce in the dry months. That creek you saw runs year-round, which makes this property more valuable than most in these parts. He showed her the boundaries of the ranch, the best grazing areas, the small apple orchard behind the house that Martha tended, and the vegetative garden that would now be part of Grace's responsibility. "It's magnificent," Grace said sincerely as they paused atop a rise overlooking the property. "You've built something truly special here, Mr. Garrett." A hint of pride crossed his face. "Been a lot of work. Still is, every day." He turned in his saddle to face her more directly. "Miss Lawson, there's something we should discuss before we return." Grace tensed, wondering if he'd reconsidered his offer. "Your condition," he said carefully, his eyes briefly dropping to her midsection, where her pregnancy wasn't yet visible beneath her dress. "I assume you're planning to keep the child?" Grace's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. "Yes," she said firmly. "Whatever else happens, this child is mine." Henry nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. "Then we should be clear about expectations. Your job here is secure, including after the baby comes. The ranch is remote enough that folks who might gossip won't often visit, but when they do, you'll be introduced as a widow. It's simpler that way." Grace was stunned by his consideration. "You would do that? Let me stay, even with a child?" "Like I said, my mother was in a similar position once. She wasn't shown such kindness." His expression darkened momentarily. "Had to give up her child me for a time, until she could establish herself. I was raised by relatives until I was 5. Don't wish that separation on anyone." His revelation answered one of Grace's questions from the night before. "Thank you for telling me that, and for your generosity." "It's not generosity," he corrected. "It's simple decency. And you'll work hard for your keep, make no mistake." "I expect nothing less," Grace assured him. As they turned their horses back toward the ranch house, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the warmth of being valued, of being seen as more than her mistakes. It was a feeling she would guard carefully, knowing how quickly such acceptance could be withdrawn. Over the following weeks, Grace settled into life at the Double G Ranch. The work was demanding cooking for 7 hungry men 3 times a day, keeping the main house clean, tending to the laundry, and helping Martha with the garden. But it was honest work that left her too tired to dwell on the past, and for that, she was grateful. The ranch hands treated her with a respectful distance that gradually warmed into something like friendship. Old Pete would bring her wildflowers he found on the range. Charlie eagerly volunteered to fetch water or chop extra firewood, and Eduardo, learning of her interest in cooking, sometimes brought herbs from the hills that his mother had taught him were good for seasoning. Martha Wilson became a mentor and confidant, showing Grace how to manage the household efficiently and listening without judgment when Grace finally shared the full story of her disgrace in Carson City. Frank was more reserved but unfailingly kind, treating Grace with a fatherly protectiveness that reminded her achingly of her own father. As for Henry Garrett, he remained something of an enigma. He was fair and respectful, occasionally joining Grace for coffee in the evenings after the other men had retired to the bunkhouse. During these quiet moments, they would talk about books they'd read, their childhoods, the changing seasons. Henry revealed little about his past beyond what he'd already shared, but Grace learned he had been raised in Missouri, had fought briefly for the Union in the final year of the Civil War when he was barely 18, and had come west afterwards seeking a fresh start. "Why Nevada?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple. "Wanted land of my own," he replied, his gaze on the distant mountains. This territory was still open enough that a man with determination and a little luck could build something. "You've built something remarkable," Grace said, meaning it. Henry glanced at her, something warm and appreciative in his eyes. "Lot of work still to do." "Always is on a ranch." These moments of connection were brief but increasingly precious to Grace. She found herself looking forward to them, to the rare smile that would transform Henry's serious face, to the quiet strength he radiated. It was dangerous territory, she knew, developing feelings for her employer, a man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. Such feelings could jeopardize everything. As summer gave way to autumn, Grace's condition became increasingly difficult to conceal. Her dresses grew tighter across her expanding middle, and Martha discreetly helped her let out the seams. The morning sickness that had plagued her early on faded, but new discomforts took its place. An aching back, swollen ankles, and a persistent fatigue that made her daily tasks more challenging. Henry noticed but said nothing, though he occasionally instructed the hands to bring in extra water or firewood to spare Grace the effort. His consideration touched her deeply, even as she tried to maintain her independence and fulfill her duties. One crisp October morning, as Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Visitors were rare at the remote ranch, and she instinctively moved toward the shelter of the house, mindful of Henry's suggestion that she avoid scrutiny from outsiders. Before she could reach the door, however, the riders came into view around the side of the house. To her horror, she recognized Sheriff Thompson from Carson City, accompanied by two men she didn't know. Grace froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Had they come for her? Why? She had broken no laws, committed no crime beyond violating social conventions. The sheriff spotted her immediately, his expression registering surprise, followed by a flash of something like shame. "Miss Lawson," he acknowledged with a tight nod. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "What brings you to the Double G?" Before he could answer, Henry strode out from the stables, alerted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. His posture was relaxed but watchful as he approached. "Sheriff Thompson," he greeted the lawman. "Something I can help you with?" The sheriff dismounted, removing his hat. "Mr. Garrett, we're tracking a gang that robbed the bank in Carson City 2 days ago. Thought they might have headed this way." Grace released the breath she'd been holding. They hadn't come for her after all. Henry nodded, all business now. "Haven't seen any strangers passing through, but we'll keep an eye out. How many men are you looking for?" As the men discussed the details of the robbery and the suspects, Grace quietly excused herself and retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. Through the window, she watched the interaction, noticing how the sheriff's gaze occasionally drifted toward the house, toward her. When Martha came in from the garden, she took one look at Grace's pale face and insisted she sit down. "The sheriff from Carson City is here," Grace explained in a low voice. "The man who told me to leave town." Martha's expression hardened. "Has he come to cause trouble?" "No, they're looking for bank robbers, but seeing him again—" Grace trailed off, unable to articulate the flood of emotions the man's presence had triggered. Martha squeezed her shoulder. "You're not alone this time, dear." After what seemed like an eternity, the riders departed. Henry came to the kitchen shortly after, his expression grave. "You all right?" he asked Grace directly. "Yes," she said, then amended, "I will be. It was just a shock, seeing him again." Henry nodded, understanding. "The sheriff asked about you, wanted to know if you were causing any trouble here." Grace flinched at the implication. "What did you tell him?" "Told him you were the finest housekeeper this ranch has ever had, and that your personal affairs were none of his concern." A hint of steel entered Henry's voice. "Then I suggested he and his men should be on their way if they wanted to catch those robbers before nightfall." The tension in Grace's shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you." "No need for thanks. It's the truth." Henry hesitated, then added, "Grace, you have a home here for as long as you want it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." It was the first time he had called her by her first name, and the simple intimacy of it, combined with his unwavering support, brought tears to her eyes. "I don't know why you've been so kind to me," she said softly, "but I'm grateful for it every day." Something shifted in Henry's expression, then a softening around the eyes, a vulnerability that he quickly masked. "Get some rest," he said. "You look tired." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Grace to wonder at the emotion she'd glimpsed in his eyes. Had it been mere concern, or something deeper? The bank robbers were caught 3 days later in a town 20 miles west, bringing a sense of relief to the Double G. The incident faded into the background as preparations for winter consumed the ranch's attention. Hay needed to be stored, repairs made to the buildings, food preserved for the months when the garden would lie dormant. Grace threw herself into these tasks with determination, despite her advancing pregnancy. By November, she could no longer hide her condition from anyone, though the ranch hands pretended not to notice, maintaining the fiction that she was a young widow. Only once did Charlie, the youngest hand, make a thoughtless comment about her expanding waistline, earning himself a swift rebuke from old Pete and a week of the most unpleasant chores from Frank. As winter settled over the Nevada landscape, the rhythm of ranch life slowed somewhat. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures near the creek, and the men spent more time in the barn, mending tack and tools, than out on the range. This meant more meals served in the main house, more mud tracked across freshly swept floors, and more laundry for Grace to manage. One stormy December evening, as wind howled around the eaves of the house, Grace found herself alone in the kitchen after supper. The men had returned to the bunkhouse earlier than usual, eager to avoid the worsening weather, and Martha had retired with a headache. Henry had ridden out that morning to check on cattle in the far pasture and had not yet returned, causing a knot of worry to form in Grace's stomach. She was washing the last of the dishes when the back door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and a half-frozen Henry Garrett. His coat was crusted with ice, his face wind-burned, and he moved with the stiffness of a man who had been too long in the cold. "Mr. Garrett!" Grace exclaimed, hurrying to help him remove his frozen outer garments. "You're half frozen to death." "Got caught in the storm," he managed through chattering teeth. "Horse through a shoe, had to walk the last 3 miles. Grace's heart clenched at the thought of him struggling through the blizzard alone. "Sit by the fire," she instructed, leading him to the kitchen hearth where flames still burned brightly. "I'll make coffee and heat some stew." As Henry thawed by the fire, Grace moved efficiently around the kitchen, heating leftover stew and brewing strong coffee. She brought both to him, then fetched a blanket from the sitting room to wrap around his broad shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "Wasn't sure I'd make it back before morning." "You shouldn't have been out there alone," Grace chided gently, surprising herself with her boldness. "Not with a storm coming." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Worried about me, Miss Lawson?" "Someone has to," she replied, then blushed at her own admission. Henry's eyes, warmed by firelight, held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "I appreciate the concern." Grace busied herself with tidying the kitchen while Henry ate, hyper-aware of his presence, of the unusual intimacy of being alone with him. When he had finished, she took his empty bowl. "You should get some proper rest," she suggested. "You've had a difficult day." Henry nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he watched as Grace wiped down the table, his gaze thoughtful. "May I ask you something, Grace?" Again, the use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Coming here, I mean, taking this position." The question surprised her. "No," she answered honestly. "Never. This place has been my salvation." Henry seemed to consider her words carefully. "And the child's father? Do you regret him?" Grace stilled, one hand unconsciously moving to her rounded belly. It was the first time Henry had directly referenced her pregnancy's origins. "I regret my naivety," she said slowly. "I regret believing his promises, but I cannot regret the child." Henry nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. "You're a remarkable woman, Grace Lawson." The compliment, so unexpected and sincere, warmed her more deeply than the fire. "I'm just doing my best to survive, Mr. Garrett." "Henry," he corrected softly. "I think, when we're alone at least, you might call me Henry." The simple request shifted something between them, acknowledging a growing connection that went beyond employer and employee. "Henry," Grace repeated, testing the name on her tongue. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. In that moment, Grace felt a sense of belonging, of rightness, that had eluded her for so long. This place, this man, they had become more than a refuge. They had become home. The storm raged for 3 days, effectively cutting off the Double G Ranch from the outside world. During this time, a subtle shift occurred in Grace and Henry's relationship. He sought her company more openly, joining her in the kitchen while she worked, sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, listening attentively when she spoke of her own past. On the third evening, as they sat in the kitchen drinking tea after the others had gone to bed, Henry revealed more of his history than he ever had before. "My mother was 16 when she found herself with child," he said quietly, staring into the depths of his cup. "The man responsible was the son of her employer. She worked as a housemaid for a wealthy family in St. Louis. When her condition became known, she was dismissed without a reference." Grace listened silently, honored by his trust in sharing this personal history. "She had no family who would take her in, no money, nowhere to go. A distant cousin finally agreed to raise me until she could establish herself somewhere new. She found work as a laundress, saved every penny, eventually opened a small boarding house." Henry's expression softened with pride. "Worked herself to the bone to give me a good life. To her dying day, she never spoke ill of my father or the family that cast her out." "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Grace said softly. "She was. Taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by others' opinions or by past mistakes." Henry looked up, meeting Grace's eyes. "When I saw you at that crossroads, I saw something of her in you, that same determination, that dignity even in desperate circumstances." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm honored by the comparison." Henry reached across the table, hesitantly taking her hand in his larger one. "I want you to know, Grace, that whatever happens, you and your child will always have a place here, not just as my housekeeper, but as someone I care about." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet sincerity, touched Grace deeply. "Thank you, Henry. That means more than I can say." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the gentle touch sending warmth spiraling through her. "When is the baby due?" he asked. "February, I think. Maybe early March. Martha's delivered babies before, and there's a doctor in Silver Springs, about 20 miles east. When the time comes, we'll make sure you have whatever you need." The "we" in his statement wrapped around Grace like a protective embrace. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she felt not just resignation about her impending motherhood, but actual anticipation, even joy. The storm finally broke the next morning, revealing a landscape transformed by snow. The men set about clearing paths to the barn and stables, checking on livestock and assessing any damage from the blizzard. Grace watched from the kitchen window as Henry directed these efforts, struck by his capability, his natural leadership, and she could admit it to herself, now his handsome figure against the snowy backdrop. "He's a good man," Martha commented, coming to stand beside Grace at the window. "One of the best I've known." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "And he looks at you differently than he looks at anyone else," Martha continued, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Martha, Grace protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. He's just being kind. Henry Garrett doesn't do anything just for kindness. He respects you, admires you. Martha patted Grace's arm. And, if I'm not mistaken, there's something more growing there too. Grace sighed, unable to deny it any longer, even to herself. Even if that were true, what future could there be? I'm carrying another man's child. I have nothing to offer someone like him. Martha's expression grew serious. You offer yourself, Grace, your heart, your spirit. Don't undervalue those gifts. Before Grace could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. A rider was approaching the ranch at speed, his horse laboring through the deep snow. As he drew closer, Grace recognized Charlie, who had left 2 days before the storm to deliver a message to a neighboring ranch. Henry met the young ranch hand in the yard, and even from a distance, Grace could tell from their body language that something was wrong. She opened the back door just as Henry turned toward the house, his expression grim. "What's happened?" she called. "Trouble," Henry replied tersely. The McKinney place was hit by rustlers during the storm. John McKinney was shot. He's alive, but barely. The news sent a ripple of tension through the ranch. The McKinneys were their nearest neighbors, about 15 miles to the east. If rustlers were operating in the area, the Double G could be next. Henry called the men together, establishing a rotation of armed patrols around the property's boundaries. The casual atmosphere of the ranch disappeared, replaced by a watchful alertness that reminded Grace how precarious life on the frontier could be. That night, as Grace prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Henry standing there, a worried frown creasing his forehead. "I wanted to make sure you weren't frightened," he said. "The men and I will keep the ranch secure." "I'm concerned, not frightened," Grace replied, touched by his consideration. Henry nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. Still, I've asked Frank to sleep in the house tonight, just as a precaution, Martha too. And you? I'll be patrolling with Mike and Eduardo. Old Pete and Tom will take the second watch." Grace frowned. "You need rest too." A smile briefly lightened Henry's serious expression. "Is that concern I hear, Miss Lawson?" "Of course it is, Henry." She met his gaze directly. "Please be careful." Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth, an intensity that made Grace's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her. But he simply nodded. "I will. Sleep well, Grace." As he turned to go, Grace impulsively caught his hand. "Henry." He looked back, questioning. "Thank you. For everything. For giving me a home when I had none. For seeing me as more than my mistakes." Henry's expression softened. His free hand came up to gently touch her cheek. The contact brief but electric. "You are so much more than any mistake, Grace Lawson." The tender moment was interrupted by Frank calling from outside, and Henry reluctantly withdrew. "Lock your door," he instructed before disappearing down the hallway. Grace did as he suggested, then leaned against the closed door, her heart racing and her cheek still tingling from his touch. Despite the danger lurking beyond the ranch's boundaries, she felt strangely at peace. Whatever came, she was no longer facing it alone. The threat of rustlers kept the Double G on high alert for the next 2 weeks. The men patrolled in pairs, always armed, while Henry rode to neighboring ranches to coordinate defenses. Grace worried constantly about his safety, but channeled her anxiety into caring for the household, making sure hot meals and clean clothing were always ready for the weary men. Christmas approached, bringing a brief respite from the tension. Despite the circumstances, Martha insisted they observe the holiday properly. "Lord knows we could use some cheer," she declared as she supervised the hanging of pine boughs and holly around the main house. On Christmas Eve, all the hands gathered in the main house for a special dinner. Grace had spent days preparing, roasting a ham, baking pies, and making cornbread stuffing. The table groaned with food, and even the constant vigilance of recent weeks gave way to laughter and storytelling. Henry sat at the head of the table, more relaxed than Grace had seen him since the news of the rustlers. His eyes found hers repeatedly throughout the meal, a silent communication that warmed her more than the roaring fire in the hearth. After dinner, old Pete surprised everyone by producing a fiddle, and Eduardo revealed a previously hidden talent for guitar. The furniture was pushed back, and impromptu dancing began. Grace watched from the sidelines, her advanced pregnancy making such activities impractical, but she clapped in time to the music, enjoying the rare festivity. "Not joining in?" Henry asked, coming to stand beside her. Grace laughed, patting her rounded belly. "Not in my condition. But it's wonderful to see everyone enjoying themselves." Henry's gaze was warm as it rested on her. "You've given them that. This meal, this celebration, it's brought back some of what we've been missing since the trouble started." "It's the least I could do," Grace replied. "You've all been working so hard." Henry was quiet for a moment, watching the dancers. "I have something for you," he said finally. "A Christmas gift. I wasn't sure when to give it to you, but—" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Henry, you shouldn't have," Grace protested, even as she accepted the gift. "Open it," he encouraged. Grace carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small, intricately carved wooden cradle, just the right size for a doll or a small infant. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's a model," Henry explained. "I'm making a full-size one for the baby. Should be ready well before February." Tears blurred Grace's vision. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the hours of careful work it represented, touched her deeply. "I don't know what to say." "Say you like it," Henry suggested, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "I love it," Grace assured him. "It's the most meaningful gift I've ever received." Henry's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Good. That's good." The moment was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of approaching horses and men's voices raised in alarm. Henry was instantly alert, moving toward the door with Frank close behind. "Stay inside," he instructed the others, reaching for his gun belt. Grace felt her heart drop as the festive atmosphere evaporated. The men followed Henry outside, while Martha herded Grace and the ranch hands' wives who had joined them for the celebration away from the windows. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for news. Finally, the door opened and Henry reappeared, his expression somber but relieved. "It's all right," he announced. "It's Sheriff Thompson from Carson City with a posse. They've captured the rustlers and wanted to let us know we're no longer in danger." A collective sigh of relief went through the room, but Grace felt a fresh anxiety. Sheriff Thompson, here again? Would he recognize her? Would he cause trouble? As if reading her thoughts, Henry moved to her side. "It's all right," he said quietly. "He's not here about you. And if he says anything, he'll answer to me." The sheriff and two of his men were invited in to warm themselves before continuing their journey. Thompson's eyes widened slightly when he spotted Grace, clearly pregnant now, but he made no comment. Instead, he accepted the coffee Martha offered and explained how they had tracked the rustlers to their hideout in the hills. "Caught them red-handed with McKinney's cattle," he reported. "They won't be bothering anyone for a long time." "We're obliged for the warning," Henry said formally. The sheriff nodded, his gaze straying to Grace again. "Miss Lawson," he acknowledged stiffly, "you're looking well." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I am well." Something like shame flickered across Thompson's face. "Good. That's good to hear." The moment passed, and soon the sheriff and his men departed to continue to the next ranch with their news. As the door closed behind them, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You handled that with dignity," Henry said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I've learned from the best," Grace replied, thinking of his mother, of Martha, of the quiet strength Henry himself displayed daily. The remainder of the evening was more subdued, but the relief of knowing the danger had passed brought its own kind of joy. As the celebration wound down and the hands returned to the bunkhouse, Grace found herself alone with Henry in the main room, the fire burning low in the hearth. "Quite a Christmas Eve," he remarked, stoking the fire. "One I'll always remember," Grace agreed, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the model cradle she had placed on the mantelpiece. Henry watched her for a long moment. "Grace," he began, then hesitated. "There's something I've been wanting to say to you." Before he could continue, however, Grace gasped, her hand flying to her belly. "What is it?" Henry asked, alarmed. "Is it the baby?" Grace shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. "No, it's nothing wrong. The baby kicks stronger than ever before." Without thinking, she reached for Henry's hand and placed it on her stomach. There, did you feel that? Henry's expression transformed as he felt the movement beneath his palm, wonder, tenderness, and something deeper that made Grace's heart race. That's amazing, he whispered. They stood like that, connected by the new life moving beneath their joined hands. For several heartbeats. Then Henry gently withdrew, though his eyes remained fixed on Grace's. What were you going to say? She asked. Henry shook his head slightly as if coming back to himself. It can wait until morning. You should rest. Though disappointed, Grace nodded. Good night, Henry. Good night, Grace. He watched as she gathered her shawl and the model cradle, his expression unreadable. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, she replied softly before making her way to her room, where she lay awake for a long time, replaying the evening's events and wondering what Henry had been about to tell her. New Year came and went, bringing with it a thaw that temporarily turned the ranch into a sea of mud before freezing again. January passed in a blur of daily routines and increasing physical discomfort for Grace as her pregnancy entered its final stages. Martha fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and take on fewer duties, while the ranch hands volunteered for tasks that would normally fall to the housekeeper. Henry, meanwhile, seemed to be keeping his distance. The intimate moment they had shared on Christmas Eve wasn't repeated, and though he remained unfailingly kind and considerate, Grace sensed he was deliberately maintaining a certain formality between them. Had she misread his intentions? Had the connection she thought they were forming been merely in her imagination? These questions plagued her as January gave way to February and her time grew near. The baby became increasingly active, often keeping Grace awake at night with its restless movements. During one such sleepless night, she made her way to the kitchen for a cup of tea, only to find Henry already there, staring into a cup of coffee. Can't sleep? He asked, looking up as she entered. Your future cowhands seem determined to practice their roping skills on my ribs, Grace replied with a tired smile, placing a hand on her swollen belly. Henry chuckled, rising to pull out a chair for her. Sounds like a born rancher already. Or rancheress, Grace countered. It could be a girl. Either way, they'll be welcome at Double G. Henry poured her a cup of tea from the kettle he'd already heated. Grace accepted it gratefully. Thank you for everything, Henry. I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't stopped that day at the crossroads. Henry's expression grew serious. I've been meaning to talk to you about that, about the future. Grace's heart quickened. Oh? The baby will be here soon. And I've been thinking... He paused, seeming to struggle for words. I know this isn't conventional, Grace. None of this is, but I care for you. More than I should, perhaps, as your employer. Grace hardly dared breathe. And I care for you, Henry. He reached across the table to take her hand. I want to offer you and your child a permanent place here, not just as my housekeeper, but as my wife. The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Grace stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or duty-bound obligation. Henry, she said carefully, I don't want your pity or your sense of responsibility. If you're asking out of some misplaced notion of protecting me... Grace, he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. I'm asking because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because the thought of you ever leaving this ranch, leaving me, is more than I can bear. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. Even though the child isn't yours, even though people will talk, especially because people will talk, Henry said with unexpected fierceness. Let them talk, let them judge. I meant what I said. That first day you'll find no judgment on my land. And as for the child, his expression softened. I would be honored to raise him or her as my own. Grace felt as if her heart might burst with joy and disbelief. You truly mean it? With all my heart. Henry rose, coming around the table to kneel awkwardly beside her chair, still holding her hand. Grace Lawson, will you marry me? Through tears of happiness, Grace managed to nod. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Henry Garrett. His face broke into a smile more radiant than any she had seen before. Leaning forward, he kissed her a gentle, reverent kiss that promised a lifetime of love and protection. When they parted, Both breathless and smiling, Grace laughed softly. "Martha is going to say she knew all along." Henry grinned. "Martha has been dropping hints about what a fine wife you would make since October." Their shared laughter sealed the moment, a perfect happiness that neither had dared hope for when they first met at that dusty crossroads. The following morning, Henry announced their engagement to the household. Martha did indeed claim she had seen it coming all along, while Frank offered gruff congratulations, and the ranch hands reacted with varying degrees of surprise and approval. It was decided that they would marry as soon as possible, before the baby's arrival, if Grace felt well enough. Judge Wilson from Silver Springs, a friend of Henry's, agreed to ride out to perform the ceremony the very next weekend. The days leading up to it passed in a flurry of preparations, with Martha and the ranch hands' wives helping Grace alter one of her better dresses to accommodate her pregnancy for the wedding. The day itself dawned clear and cold, a perfect February morning with sunlight sparkling on the snow-covered landscape. The ceremony was held in the main room of the ranch house, with Frank serving as Henry's best man and Martha standing with Grace. The ranch hands and their families formed a small but enthusiastic congregation. Grace, wearing her altered blue dress with a crown of winter greenery in her hair, felt a sense of rightness as she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor Henry for all her days. The look in his eyes as he placed a simple gold band on her finger told her that he felt the same certainty, the same joy in their union. Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry kissed her with a restrained passion that brought cheers from their small audience. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. A feast prepared by Martha and the other women, music from Old Pete's fiddle, and an atmosphere of genuine happiness that Grace had never expected to find again after her disgrace in Carson City. That night, as she and Henry retired to what was now their shared bedroom, his larger quarters upstairs, Grace felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Henry seemed to sense her uncertainty. "We don't have to, that is, in your condition," he began awkwardly. Grace smiled, touched by his consideration. "I'm not made of glass, Henry. I want to be your wife in every way." His answering smile was both relieved and tender. "I just want you to be comfortable, happy." "I am," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." That night, Henry showed her that physical love could be gentle, respectful, and deeply satisfying, everything her previous experience had not been. In the safety of his arms, Grace finally let go of the last of her shame, accepting his love as the gift it was and offering her own in return. The following days settled into a new rhythm as they adjusted to married life. Henry insisted that Grace reduce her housekeeping duties even further, hiring a young woman from Silver Springs to help with the heavier work. Grace protested at first, but when the doctor who came to check on her warned that she was doing too much, she reluctantly agreed. "I want to be useful," she complained to Henry one evening as they sat by the fire. "I'm not used to idleness." Henry chuckled, his arm around her shoulders. "You're growing a whole new person, Grace. I'd hardly call that idle." His hand moved to rest on her belly, where the baby was performing its nightly acrobatics. "Besides, you'll have your hands full soon enough." Grace covered his hand with hers, savoring the connection. "Do you have a preference, boy or girl?" Henry considered the question seriously. "A healthy child is all I pray for. But I'll admit, the thought of a little girl with your honey-colored hair and stubborn chin has a certain appeal." Grace laughed. "Stubborn, am I?" "Determined," Henry corrected with a smile. "It's one of the things I love most about you." 2 weeks after their wedding, in the middle of a clear, cold night, Grace woke to a sharp pain and the realization that her time had come. She woke Henry, who immediately called for Martha and sent one of the hands to fetch the doctor from Silver Springs. The labor was long and difficult. By the time the doctor arrived, Grace had been struggling for hours, her strength beginning to wane. Henry refused to leave her side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as she battled through a particularly intense pain. "You can do this, Grace. I'm right here with you." Just as dawn broke over the eastern hills, a lusty cry announced the arrival of their child, a boy with a shock of dark hair and strong lungs. The doctor cleaned and swaddled him before placing him in Grace's weary arms. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears of joy and exhaustion mingling on her cheeks. Henry leaned close, one arm around Grace's shoulders, the other gently touching his new son's tiny hand. "He is," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his mother." When the doctor asked for the child's name to record in his ledger, Henry looked to Grace. They had discussed various possibilities, but hadn't settled on anything definite. "William," Grace said softly. "William Henry Garrett." Henry's eyes widened slightly. "After my father? You're sure?" Grace nodded. "He should have his father's name." The simple statement acknowledging Henry as the child's true father, in every way that mattered, moved him visibly. "William Henry Garrett it is," he agreed, placing a gentle kiss on Grace's forehead and then on his son's. The news of William's birth spread quickly through the ranch and to neighboring properties. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, and to Grace's surprise, their circumstances raised no eyebrows. Whether people assumed the child had been born a bit early or simply chose not to comment out of respect for Henry, the dreaded judgment she had feared never materialized. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after William's birth, as Grace was rocking the baby in the front room, Henry came in from his work looking unusually thoughtful. "Everything all right?" Grace asked, noting his expression. Henry nodded, settling into the chair opposite her. "Had an interesting visitor today. Sheriff Thompson rode out from Carson City." Grace tensed. What did he want? To apologize, actually. Henry's expression was a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. "For how the town treated you. Seems your case has caused quite a stir in Carson City over the past months. Several prominent ladies have taken up your cause, arguing that the town's reaction was unnecessarily harsh and uncharitable." "My cause?" Grace repeated, stunned. "Why would anyone care about what happened to me?" "Apparently, your old Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had something of a change of heart after you left. Started questioning whether Christian charity shouldn't extend to young women in your situation. She and some others have been working to establish a home for unwed mothers in Carson City." Henry's lips quirked in a slight smile. The sheriff seemed quite chagrined about the whole affair. Grace looked down at William, peaceful in her arms. "It's too late for me, but I'm glad if it helps other young women." He also mentioned that several people have been asking after you, expressing regret for how things were handled. Henry watched her carefully. "He extended an invitation for us to visit Carson City, if we're ever so inclined." Grace considered this. The town that had driven her out with gunfire and harsh words now wanted to welcome her back. It seemed almost too strange to believe. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I said we'd consider it in time." Henry reached over to take her free hand. "But that you had a new home now, a family who loved you, and no obligation to return anywhere you weren't comfortable." Gratitude washed over Grace. "Thank you? For what?" "For standing up for me. For giving me and William a home. For everything." Henry smiled, the special smile that was reserved just for her, and now for their son. "That's what family does, Grace. And we are a family now, you, me, and William. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As spring returned to the Nevada landscape, bringing new growth and possibility, the little family at the Double G Ranch flourished. William grew stronger daily, delighting his parents with each new achievement, his first real smile, his first attempt to roll over, his first delighted laugh at the antics of a ranch dog. Grace gradually resumed her duties as the ranch's mistress, balancing motherhood with the responsibilities of running the household. Henry proudly showed off his son to visitors, never giving any indication that William was not his by blood. To all who saw them, they were simply a happy young family building their life together. One warm May evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, William sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby, Henry turned to Grace with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about something," he began, "about Carson City." Grace felt a flicker of unease. "What about it?" "I think we should go, not to stay, just to visit." He took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "I want to walk down that main street with you on my arm and our son in your arms. I want those people to see what they cast aside, a beautiful, kind, loving woman who has become the heart of our home." Grace considered his words. The thought of returning to Carson City still brought a twist of anxiety to her stomach, but it was less sharp than before. "You want to show them they were wrong about me." "I want to show you they were wrong about you," Henry corrected gently. "And maybe it would help you put the past to rest completely." Grace looked at their entwined hands, then at their sleeping son. So much had changed since that terrible day when she had stumbled down Carson City's main street, bleeding and disgraced. She had found safety, purpose, love, a completely new life that she wouldn't trade for anything. "All right," she agreed finally. "We'll go, but only for a day." Henry smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. "That's my brave wife." 2 weeks later, they made the journey to Carson City, William securely bundled in Grace's arms and Henry driving the wagon. As they approached the town, Grace felt her heart rate increase, memories of her last day there flooding back. Henry seemed to sense her tension, reaching over to cover her hand with his. "Remember, you're Grace Garrett now, the wife of a respected rancher, the mother of a beautiful boy. You have nothing to be ashamed of." His words steadied her. And by the time they drove down the main street, Grace had composed herself. The town looked much as she remembered, though a new building or two had appeared. People on the boardwalks turned to look at the unfamiliar wagon, and Grace saw recognition dawn on several faces. They stopped outside the general store where Grace had once shopped weekly with her mother. Henry helped her down from the wagon, keeping a protective arm around her waist as they entered the store with William. The proprietor, Mr. Peterson, looked up from his ledger and froze when he saw Grace. "Miss Lawson?" he said uncertainly, then quickly corrected himself. "I mean, Mrs. Garrett, I presume. Sheriff Thompson mentioned you had married." "Yes," Grace replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My husband and I are just visiting for the day." Mr. Peterson came around the counter, his manner hesitant but not unfriendly. "It's good to see you looking so well, and this must be your little one." He peered at William, who regarded him with solemn baby eyes. "Our son, William," Henry confirmed, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of pride that dared anyone to suggest the child was anything but his. "A fine boy," Mr. Peterson nodded. "Mrs. Peterson will be sorry she missed you. She's at a meeting about the new home for young women they're establishing." He looked directly at Grace. "Your situation. It got some of the ladies thinking about Christian charity, about how we as a community might do better." Grace wasn't quite ready to forgive so easily, but she acknowledged his words with a nod. "I'm glad if some good has come of it." Their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, Grace's former Sunday school teacher. The older woman stopped short at the sight of Grace, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "Grace," she said, stepping forward, "I had heard you were married. You look very well." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Grace replied. "I am well. May I introduce my husband, Henry Garrett?" Mrs. Henderson extended a trembling hand to Henry. "Mr. Garrett, I understand you own a ranch near Silver Springs?" "The Double G," Henry confirmed, his manner courteous but reserved. "And this is our son, William." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the baby. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms hesitantly. After a moment's consideration, Grace carefully transferred William to the older woman's arms. Mrs. Henderson cradled him gently, studying his face with something like wonder. "He's beautiful, Grace," she said softly. "Truly beautiful." She looked up, meeting Grace's eyes directly. "I owe you an apology. What happened, how the town reacted, it wasn't right." Grace hadn't expected such a direct acknowledgement, and it caught her off guard. "Thank you for saying so," she managed. "We're establishing a home," Mrs. Henderson continued, "for young women in difficult circumstances, a place where they can receive care and support, not judgment. Your experience, it opened my eyes to how far we had strayed from true Christian principles." Grace felt a complex mixture of emotions, vindication, lingering hurt, but also a cautious hope that perhaps some good might come from her ordeal. "I hope it helps others," she said simply. Their visit to Carson City continued with similar encounters. People who had once shunned Grace now approaching with cautious apologies or, at minimum, respectful acknowledgments. Not everyone was contrite. Some still averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands. But Grace found that their disapproval no longer held power over her. As they prepared to leave town, one final encounter awaited them. Sheriff Thompson approached their wagon, his manner awkward but determined. "Mrs. Garrett," he began formally, "I wanted to express my regrets about how things were handled when you left Carson City. As an officer of the law, I should have protected you, not participated in driving you out." Grace studied him, remembering the man who had told her to be gone by sundown. "Yes, you should have," she agreed, her voice level. "But perhaps it was for the best. If I had stayed, I might never have found my way to the Double G. I might never have met my husband." Henry's arm tightened around her waist at these words, and the sheriff nodded, acknowledging the rebuke while accepting the measured forgiveness it contained. "You have built a good life," Thompson observed. "I'm glad for it." As they drove away from Carson City, Grace leaned against Henry's shoulder, William sleeping contentedly in her arms. "Thank you for today," she said, "for standing beside me." "Always," Henry promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How do you feel?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Lighter," she decided. "As if I've set down a burden I didn't realize I was still carrying." "Good," Henry said, his voice warm with approval. "Then it was worth it." They traveled in companionable silence for a while, the road leading them back toward the Double G, toward home. Finally, Grace spoke again. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said, about the home they're establishing." "Oh?" Henry glanced at her, curious. "I was wondering if we might make a contribution, a donation to help them get started." She looked down at William, peacefully sleeping through the wagon's gentle motion. "So, that other young women might have options I didn't have." Henry's face broke into a proud smile. "I think that's a fine idea, Mrs. Garrett. We'll arrange it when we return home." Home. The word filled Grace with contentment. What had begun as a desperate refuge had become so much more, a place of acceptance, of growth, of love. The town had turned away from her shame, but Henry had welcomed her, offering not just shelter, but a true partnership, a family, a future. As the Double G Ranch came into view in the distance, Grace felt a swell of gratitude for the man beside her, for the child in her arms, for the unexpected path her life had taken. The shame that had once defined her had been transformed into something beautiful and precious, a testament to the healing power of love, offered without judgment. And as they passed beneath the wooden arch that marked the entrance to the Double G, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years later, as Grace stood on the porch of the Double G's main house watching Henry teaching 5-year-old William to ride his first pony, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The small, scared young woman who had sat alone at that crossroads seemed like a different person entirely from the confident ranch mistress she had become. The Double G had prospered under Henry's capable management, growing to become one of the most successful ranches in the territory. They had added to their family as well. 3-year-old Sarah, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, was currently napping inside, and Grace's hand rested unconsciously on her stomach, where a third child had just begun to make its presence known. Their marriage had deepened with time, the initial attraction and gratitude evolving into a partnership of equals, a love strengthened by shared joys and challenges. Henry had never once made Grace feel that William was anything but his own son, and indeed, anyone seeing them together would never question the bond between father and child. Occasionally, they still visited Carson City, which had grown substantially since Grace's departure. The home for unwed mothers that Mrs. Henderson had established was thriving, partially funded by annual donations from the Garretts. Each visit became easier than the last, the painful memories fading as new ones took their place. Grace had even reconciled with some of her former neighbors, finding that time and her own evident happiness had healed wounds she once thought permanent. She would never forget how they had treated her in her hour of need, but she had chosen to release the bitterness, understanding that it served no purpose in the life she had built. William's delighted laugh drew her attention back to the present as Henry led the pony in a circle, his hands steady on the reins, while William bounced excitedly in the small saddle. "Mama, look at me! I'm riding!" William called, his face alight with joy. "I see you, sweetheart," Grace called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Henry looked up, catching her eye with a smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. In that moment, Grace felt a perfect contentment wash over her, a sense that despite all the hardship and pain, despite the shame that had once threatened to define her, she had found her way to exactly where she belonged. The town had turned away from her shame, but on Henry Garrett's land, she had found not just acceptance, but a love that had transformed them both. And for that, she would be forever grateful.